So I want to welcome everyone who was able to make it. I know that for several students, we told them that we would make the recording available. But welcome to the next Hixon Teacher Talk with the topic being Teaching in the Time of COVID-19, brought to you by Lucia Reyes. Just a little bit about Lucia. Lucia has worked with middle school age youth in underserved communities for more than 18 years. She has worked as a curriculum author, instructional coach, and is currently in her 10th year of teaching social studies in public schools. As a mother, educator, and proud Chicana, Lucia is an advocate of decolonizing curriculum and creating equitable pathways to student achievement. Lucia recently created ESTE Publishing with a vision of fostering critical literacy, empathy, and student independence through engaging and inclusive curriculum. I'm incredibly happy to introduce my good friend, an amazing educator. And so for folks that are in this space, what will happen is she's going to go over a presentation, and then we'll make definitely some time for question and answer, any sort of discussion at the end. But in the meantime, can you please, any questions you might have, type them into the chat box. I'll keep an eye out for that. In case at the end we can kind of come up with some of these and bring them up. The question was, do you have permission to record the meeting? You do, but actually I am recording the meeting, and so I'll be sending that out to everyone in this space and everyone who RSVP, but thank you for that. Other than that, welcome, Lucia.
Hi, everybody, and thank you, Dr. Rojas, for including me in this. So as Dr. Rojas said, my name is Lucia Reyes, and I am currently finishing up my 10th year in the public school classroom. I've worked in different capacities, and this year I'm teaching 7th grade social studies and 7th and 8th grade ethnic studies, which is the first of its kind within our district. So my experience to share today is based on those two classes and my students in those classes. So here is the objective for today, is that you're going to understand the good, the bad, and the ugly of teaching during this time, the time of COVID-19. And so that's how I've broken up this presentation. So we're going to start with the good. We're going to start with the positive. The good is that during this time, we have been really collaborative as teachers. We've had to be very innovative. And we've had to kind of, come together at a short moment's notice and put together distance learning opportunities for our students. And so I saw a lot of really positive things come out of those collaborative conversations. I actually created a project to share with all of the social studies teachers in our district. And so it's been a very great experience because everybody's on the same page. Not only that, but the project is a living history project. We decided, why assign students topics that are at this time really far removed from their current reality. And so we decided to create this COVID-19 living history project, and students are journaling their experiences either in written form or creating video blogs. And so we, social studies teachers, have actually had more students turning in this project than maybe in some of the other subject areas. And a lot of what I'm using for this presentation is based on my reading of those journal entries. And it's just been a really powerful insight to what our students are going through and what their families are going through at this time. So that's been one of the good things to come out of this. Another positive note is that I've increased, and I've had to increase my communication with my kids, and I've had to get creative with how I'm doing that. I've used tools that maybe I didn't use as much before, or I was a little intimidated to use before, including platforms like this. But it's really forced me to be creative in how I'm reaching out to students and how I'm checking in on students and how I'm communicating with them and their parents or their guardians during this time. And so I've been able to, form relationships, at least from a distance, with parents or guardians and students at a deeper level than I may have before, because we're able to have those one-on-one conversations. So that's another good thing. And so, like I mentioned, with parents and with students. Another positive thing that's come out of this is just my 7th grade team has become closer knit than it was before, because this is such a surreal experience, and it's It's hard to explain to somebody outside of it what it's like. And so we have really bonded together, and we've helped each other, you know, process a lot of the emotions we're having, you know, troubleshooting a lot of the things that are unique to this situation when it comes to making sure our kids are receiving the best possible education in this time. So those are some good things. And then, like I mentioned, the creative thinking. So for example, you know, we like to celebrate our students at school. And so one of the creative ways that my self and my fellow teachers have reached out to kids is doing, you know, drive-by deliveries. And so I'll be going to a few promotions for 8th graders in a drive-by manner. And my colleagues, they went and dropped off gifts and celebrated one of our students on her birthday. And so it's really forced us to think creatively. How are we going to maintain those relationships and those connections with our kids? And so that's my experience with the good. But I wanted to give you a more well-rounded idea of what this whole experience is like. So I gathered some quotes from some of my colleagues. And here are a few of those quotes here that I pulled together. Oops, sorry. So one of my colleagues says that she gets to be with her pups all day. I concur, that's been a positive for me. Sleeping in, not having the stress of classroom management or putting on pants. I relate to that as well. Time with my family. I can go to the bathroom whenever I need to. And on that note, I'd like to say that being able to eat and snack whenever you need to is also positive, because that's sort of hard when you're rushing from class to class. And another teacher said that she feels more emotionally available for her family. And for me, what I can relate to the most is being able to spend more time with my family, because I do have a daughter, a 5-year-old daughter, and so that's been, that's her in the picture. And so that's been a positive out of this experience. And then according to the kids, this is pulled from one of the journal entries. This is what one of my students had to say. The positive things that can come from this coronavirus pandemic is that I don't have to go to school. Well, not real school, only online school, but online is way better. You can do your work whenever you want to, and you could do it in your bed. That's how I'm doing this right now. And you could do it in your underwear. That's why the coronavirus pandemic is a positive thing for me. So you can see that apparently non-pants wearing is a very popular response as to why this is not so bad of a situation, which is funny. Okay, so now for the bad. So some of the hardest stories to tell that teachers have told me and that students have told me is how our year just came to this sudden, abrupt end. At first, students were confused and they didn't know when we would be coming back to school. None of us really did. And so, you know, one of the bad things to have come out of this whole experience is that our school, they made the announcement on the 13th of March. And so since then, we just haven't been able to see our students in person. For the most part, we haven't been able to go to our classrooms. I went once to pick up something, and it was just this really bizarre, eerie, frozen in time sort of experience. But you know, for us as teachers, we form really close relationships with our kids. And I have had some of these students for 2 years in a row now, and some of them are going to high school, and you know, I will probably never see some of them again. And it's heartbreaking because you grow to love these students, and it's been really difficult to just have this sudden cutoff, this lack of closure for our school year. Technology and resources has been a real challenge for distance learning. I work at a Title I school, which means that the majority of our students are living either at or below the poverty line, and 99% of our students would qualify for free or reduced lunch, although they all receive it. And we did have a lot of technology and resources difficulties because so many of our students were expected to suddenly switch to distance learning, where so many of them didn't have personal computers or a computer at all in the home. So many of them didn't have internet access. And some of our students, you know, on a regular basis depended on school lunch, you know, and so those sort of resources that they were able to access at school was suddenly taken from them. And so we had to get really creative, and our district was great with sending out surveys and having us contact our students and finding out who needed what. And we were able to get resources out to the students and parents we were able to reach. But it was definitely a challenge, and it still is. Communication challenges. I was able to reach out to a lot of my parents and students, as I said before, but there are still so many that that none of us teachers that share these students have been able to reach. And so we depended on them coming to school on a regular basis. And so for some of our kids, they've just fallen off the grid, and we've had to, you know, ask admin for help in reaching out to some of these students. And that it goes hand in hand with the low work turn-in. I've had a lot of students participate in the COVID-19 project, but I'm still getting only about 50% of the work turned in, which is really low compared to if, you know, I was in there with them, working with them, helping them problem solve. And, you know, my rate is already higher than math, for example. There's only about 2 or 3 students turning in their math work according to their teacher. And so, you know, if they're not doing this work, we're just going to have to try and figure out what we're going to do when we start next school year. Another challenge has been balancing teaching and balancing homeschooling my own daughter. And this is something a lot of my teacher friends who have children can relate to. And so I'm thankful that my daughter's, she's a TK student, a transitional kindergarten student. So as long as I'm reading to her and we're doing a lot of projects, artwork and stuff, she's okay. But for older students, you know, it's been a real challenge for their parents who are also teachers to balance everything. And then I can speak to this personally. One of the bad things to come out of this is definitely a lack of structure for those of us, myself included, who are not as self-disciplined as can be. And so I know a lot of my students, in communicating with them, they've been going to bed at 3 in the morning and sleeping all during the day, or you know, my own daughter is off her sleep schedule, and it's just been difficult to maintain some sort of routine and structure when you're used to the bell-to-bell life. And then just there's a lot of inconsistent expectations right now about what each school is expected to do for their students. Within each school, what are teachers each communicating to their students? You know, I know that grading has been very inconsistent. At our district, we decided to cut grades off and not lower any grades that they had earned as of March 13th, but to increase their grade, improve their grade, if they have been showing effort within their distance learning. But that's not the case at every district. That's not the case at every school. And there are still teachers within my school who are not on the same page as that. And so all of those have been a lot of their challenges we've had to work through. According to my buddies, here are some of their not so positive experiences. My friend who teaches, she's my partner teacher. She also has 3 boys, 1 in elementary, middle, and high school. She says, teaching my own kids sucks and I hate it. Other comments include, I don't know what day it is. I can't teach online the way I do in person with corrections and aha moments. And that for that teacher is very powerful because she's a band and choir teacher. And so that's been a real challenge to do distance learning with her. Lack of clarity from administration, not having the ability to plan ahead makes me very apathetic and lazy. And, you know, no offense, Dr. Rojas, but Zoom and Google meetings is not necessarily a favorite of teachers. We're used to having face-to-face communication. We're used to our kids being there. We're used to very hands-on learning. And so this has just been one of those challenges that we'll have to figure out if this continues for a lot longer. And I'll go ahead and just pause here and let you sort of skim this journal entry. This is one of my students who expressed what his frustration is with this distance learning transition. So you can see that for a lot of kids, their social connections are at school, and that was for a lot of our students that constant for them. And so having that suddenly taken away has been very difficult for a lot of our students, not being able to see their friends, not being able to see their teachers, not being able to have access to our on-school counseling, for example, has been difficult. And that kind of bridges into the ugly aspect of teaching in the time of COVID. There has been, this is a traumatic time for everybody, and for so many of our students, so many of the students I personally work with, that trauma is compounded with existing trauma from from life circumstances. We have a very transient population of students. We have a lot of students in foster care. I think where I teach in East Lancaster, up here in the Antelope Valley, we have some of the highest numbers of kids in foster care. We have a significant number of kids who are homeless. And so all of these challenges that for some students may not be as traumatic, it's felt tenfold by some of our kids who don't even have some of their basic needs met. And like I mentioned earlier, some of our students access the tools and the resources they need through school. And so a lot of them are cut off from that right now. And I'm worried about a lot of my students. Our highest needs kids, you know, not just the kids who are experiencing transitions within their own home environments, but, you know, we have a lot of kids that we've had to go above and beyond what you would expect a normal teacher to do to provide for certain students. Unfortunately, we've had to make certain reports when we feel like a student is being neglected or being abused. And those are things that we notice as teachers, and we have those kids that are coming to us on a regular basis. And so for myself and for some of our colleagues, there are certain students that we are genuinely worried about their safety. We're not sure what or who is following up with them. And so for some of our highest needs kids, you know, this place of safety, this place of familiarity, school, it's not there, and it's scary for a lot of our students. And then some of them are experiencing sickness themselves, and some of them are experiencing families getting sick. I haven't had any students report to me that they have contracted the coronavirus, but I've had multiple students reach out to me that their goddad did, their godfather did, or their uncle, or in one case, a parent was tested positive. And so there's just that very real fear and the reality that some of them may contract this virus, or that somebody within their own family or friend circle may, and that's just adding more stress to the situation. When we're over here, you know, asking them to turn in Google Classroom assignments, sometimes that it conflicts with where they're at in their life. And then just the growing educational gaps. There are already huge educational gaps, as I'm sure you are aware, being in Dr. Rojas's class, but this is just adding to that. You know, I have friends whose children are in private schools or are in higher income, more affluent areas. And I see that a lot of those schools, whether I agree with it or not, are continuing to push these rigorous assignments. And it's really difficult, and I have a lot of conflict within myself about whether I continue to do that for my own students or whether I balance it with what their emotional needs are right now at this time. But I do see that growing gap. Whereas my friend's son is continuing and pushing on with his AP history course, you know, half of my students aren't even checking in. And so I see those growing educational gaps. I'm aware of the kids who are struggling, who are my students that read at a third grade level, and knowing what we can accomplish when we're in person with them, and knowing how difficult that's going to be when they're not with us in school, and when they maybe don't have two parents that are staying at home with them because their parents are working, for example. I know a lot of my students don't have that help at home. There's just continuous educational gaps that are just going to increase because of this entire situation. And then that ties directly into equity issues. And, you know, I don't know what next year is going to look like. Actually, that brings me to the next point. But I do know that we have to address these growing gaps and these issues of inequity that I see happening as a result of lack of resources, lack of training for teachers. I know that for our district, for example, we've been trying to transition to use of computers, but for so many of our students, they don't have those computers at home, and there were a lot of skills that they weren't prepared to use. And so issues like that moving forward, I know we're going to have to be creative in addressing those issues. And these are some of the comments from other teachers about the ugly part of this teaching experience. As I mentioned, my partner teacher has the same fears about some of our students, some of our most vulnerable students. Inequities of education. Nobody knows shit about what's happening. and there's no actual teaching happening. I partly agree with that, and I partly disagree. I think that there is still some teaching and learning happening. It just doesn't look the same as it would in the classroom. And we as teachers have been trying to figure this out as we go. And so we are figuring out and problem solving, you know, while we're still trying to maintain contact with our students and while we're still trying to teach them. And so there, you know, for this teacher in particular, I know for her, teaching happens in the classroom, and I tend to agree. So we're doing the best that we can. And here's a message I got from one of my students. You can see here, she says that she's sorry to bother me, which is, she's never a bother, but she hasn't been doing her work because somebody in her family caught the virus, and so now everybody's getting tested over there. And so she's assuring me that she's going to start doing her work ASAP. And I constantly get messages like this from my students who are genuinely scared that their grades are going to drop, even though we assure them they won't. They're stressing out because they're not doing their work and they feel like they should, but yet they're still dealing with these very real problems that we as adults are still struggling with how to cope with these pressures. And so, you know, my heart breaks when I receive messages like that, because I just, more than anything else right now, just want them to be safe and healthy, but at the same time, again, worried about those growing gaps in skills. So that was like really depressing, but to add in a sort of positive note, you know, some of the positive things I think are going to come out of this is that, you know, when we first transitioned to distance learning, especially, I think there were a lot of issues in education that were being highlighted and that were being brought to the attention of people who didn't realize that. I think that there was an increased appreciation for teachers from parents who were suddenly turned into homeschool teachers. I think that issues like the lack of technology available to all of our students came to light. And so I hope moving forward, we're paying attention, we don't forget, and we're problem solving how we can start closing those gaps. Innovation, I see innovation all around me with my colleagues, with my students, within their journal entries. How are they taking this time and trying to use it to be innovative and to, you know, think creatively in new ways that they maybe never would have had to before. Students are sharing with me constantly that they're learning new skills and that they're finding creative ways to communicate with their friends. And I hope that after all of this, that we really do approach education in a new and innovative way. This is our chance to try things that maybe we've been reluctant to or scared to before, but the time calls for it. And so I hope that I continue to see innovative ideas being spread and take hold. Resilience, my students, you know, those especially sometimes that have been through the toughest stuff are so resilient. And I see within so many of their journal entries, just increasing resilience and an increasing amount of patience that this is that this pandemic has called for. And I do think that my students are learning such, you know, valuable life lessons. And I hope that in addition to some of the more traumatic and scary experiences that they're going through, that they do tap into that resilience that each of them have, and that they use it moving forward. Another positive I've seen in so many of their journal entries and on their videos, a very mature global and environmental awareness. For so many of them, you know, they're 11, 12 years old, and they're writing far beyond what I would expect an 11 or 12-year-old to, you know, to express. And they're just noticing, how we got to this point in the first place, because they've been asked to look at and study the pandemic, and they've been noticing the positive effect on nature without the ever presence of humans within every environment. And so I think that, you know, I think that they're becoming more aware of how we got to this place and what we can do moving forward. And that was it. And so if you want to know anything more about the COVID-19 project, I do have it posted on my website, and this is the website here. I have some other teacher resources posted, but it's just been, you know, reading their journal entries and communicating with my kiddos has been, for me, what's given me hope in moving forward. And And yeah, I think that's it.
Yeah, no, thank you so much. That was actually going to be my question to you. And then I'm encouraging folks who are in the space to take some time right now and please type in your questions because we'll get to them in a minute. Thank you, Giselle, for posting a question for other folks in this space. You mentioned an assignment or a curriculum, I should say, that you developed. I was wondering if you could speak to that a little bit more.
Sure. So I am a social studies teacher, so I'm a huge history nerd, and my partner teacher and I realized that although we would love to continue teaching the Middle Ages, you know, our district discouraged us from teaching new content, and so we decided to have our students dig in deep and look at what's going on right now. And so I call it a living history project, because right now is definitely a time where students, you know, 100 years from now will be reading about in textbooks. And so I told my students that they were going to be responsible for creating primary sources about what it is like right now to live through the COVID-19 pandemic. And so I created a 4-part project. The first part is a vocabulary, and students just really had to get familiar with vocabulary that is relative to the pandemic, like the word pandemic, for example. And the second part was journals. So for 3 weeks, students were required to journal 3 times a week. And I gave them a number of suggestions suggestions for prompts. They could either write in Google Docs, or they could video themselves and send that to me. The third part is the assignment that they're working on this week, and it's a personal interview. They have to come up with certain questions, and then they have to choose an adult in their life to interview and find out somebody else's experience, maybe from the adult experience. How is their experience during this pandemic similar? How is it different? And then their final part of the project is to create a time capsule. And so it's cute. I just got a picture today of the first time capsule. It's not due till next week. It's their final part of the project. But students are putting in, like empty toilet paper rolls, empty, candy bar wrappers. One of the students put in like a empty bottle of hand sanitizer. And so they're creating these time capsules to, really capture the moment. And so those are the 4 parts of the project.
I love that. Thank you so much. So Giselle in this room asked, and you spoke about students who are having a hard time turning in assignments, and you gave us some examples of them having family members that actually tested positive, or for whatever reason not having access to technology at this point. And so she asked, are students like that excused on assignments? Are they given extensions?
Good question. So it really varies per district. I'm a part of a lot of social media groups of other teachers, and I can see that what we decided as a district is not the same everywhere. But for the Lancaster School District, we stopped their grades, whatever they received at the end of Q3, which we only had about a week left when schools shut down. That grade, it's going to carry on to the end of the school year. So no grades can be dropped. However, if we see a student submitting a lot of work, we can improve their grade. There's definitely some kids that, for me, have done every part of the project and are regularly in communication. For students who reach out to me personally, or who I just simply can't get a hold of or can't hear or haven't heard from, I encourage them to just sort of focus on the journaling part of it. If they're feeling overwhelmed at all, I help them just kind of zoom in and narrow down which part of the project would be most useful and beneficial for them, especially since journaling has, for many of my students, become a way of coping with this. But honestly, I know my kids by now. I'm fortunate enough to have spent 3/4 of the year with them. And so if there's a student who is experiencing something really difficult at home, or if they're just overwhelmed and stressed out about it, I'm just telling them, you know what, kiddo, don't worry about it. Don't worry about it. If you're reading, you're practicing skills that we're practicing in class. Here's a list of documentaries for social studies. But number one, I want you to be, emotionally, mentally, physically healthy. So that's my priority. And that's really been my message to them. You know, I know other teachers have tried to, you know, they've sent out packets instead. That was another option for our district, sending out packets versus online work. And so we were doing that for a long time. So kids who didn't have technology could access it in another way. So, you know, we're trying as much as we can in our district anyway to meet students where they're at during this time. I mean, it's not an average time. It's not just them being, you know, lazy. And so knowing my students and knowing what their needs are is important right now.
Thank you for that. There's another question that says, earlier you mentioned that some low-income schools can't provide the resources to their students. So what are the students doing academically, or, you know, what are they doing if the schools can't provide resources to them?
So I can only speak to what we did at the school that I'm at. I'm at a middle school, so it's 6th, 7th, and 8th grade. And we sent out multiple automated phone calls and you know, emails, and multiple, like from the principal's level, she sent out multiple notifications that we would be checking out Chromebooks. And so my principal and the technology team behind the scenes gathered as many Chromebooks as possible from each of our classrooms. And we as teachers were responsible for reaching out to our homeroom students and making sure that we each came into contact with our homeroom students and found out who needed technology. And so we were able to secure a list. I know out of my homeroom, I had maybe 7 kids who needed Chromebooks, and 2 who didn't even have, who needed Chromebook, and they also needed internet. And so we as a school were able to provide those for them. And so they checked them out, and, you know, it was a very organized process, you know, writing down the number of the Chromebook. And they were able to also check out hotspots. And so, you know, that's how we were able to meet those needs. Unfortunately, like I mentioned earlier, you know, some students we weren't able to get a hold of at all, or some students did sign up and then they never showed up to pick it up. And so at that point, we as teachers, we turn those names over to our administration, and they, you know, do what they need to get in touch with those kids. I know that they've made a couple of home visits, for example. And so providing them with those resources has been, you know, a huge part of our transition to distance learning. And then I get like really creative. If there's a kid I can't get a hold of, I start hunting down their friends. I start hunting them down through social media. I'm like, I need to know that you're okay. You know, that doesn't necessarily meet their educational needs you know, but knowing they're okay makes me know, okay, so like at what point can I start saying, okay, now that I know you're okay, hey, let me recommend this documentary, you know, to you, or let me recommend a book for you, or you know, I have some colleagues that are, you know, sending books to students. And so, you know, we've tried to get creative with that.
Great, thank you. As you think about the end of the year, because I know you're approaching the end of your semester, and can you speak to, maybe not necessarily at your school district, but I know you're speaking to other educators, what potentially the fall might look like, or what have you heard in terms of, as we move forward for kids in terms of the new school year?
Mm-hmm. So just yesterday, we received a survey from our district. And, you know, I'm not only a teacher in our district, but my daughter does attend an elementary school in our district. So I received the survey for parents, and it sort of just provides a few options. And one of the options is just, you know, full in class as before, but following all of the safety and health guidelines that the CDC has put out. The second option was for kind of like an A-B scheduling. So like some of the kids will come in on Monday, Wednesday, the other half will come in Tuesday, Thursday, and then on Fridays they'll work from home. The other option is all distance learning, but being available, I think at least twice a week on campus for like small group check-in or for office hours, so to speak. And then the other option was full distance learning. And so, you know, those are just 4 of the options they're putting out there. We don't know yet what what the decision is going to be. We normally go back early August. And so, you know, we're going to have to figure something out. That's part of what's so stressful about all of this. And then me personally, just, you know, being nervous about going back and nervous about my daughter going back. As much as I miss my kids, I want it to be safe, because, you know, one of the other things that this pandemic has shown us is that, you know, there's a huge disparity in terms of which racial groups and which economic groups are being most hard hit by the virus. And so I have a lot of fears, but anyway, I got off track. So those are the 4 options that we're looking at.
Yeah, thank you. I want to give folks another 30 seconds or so. If you have any questions, go ahead and type them into the chat box now. And Lucia, as folks potentially type in any questions, what gives you hope during this time as we think about now or in the future? What is kind of giving you life or giving you hope during this time in terms of teaching and your students?
You know, I sort of mentioned it before, but I assigned this COVID project and I assigned the journaling for them, you know, for them to process this time and for them to still practice their writing and for them to learn about, you know, about the coronavirus. But it really has been a tool for me. It's been a way for me to cope as well, because, you know, reading their journal entries makes me feel closer to them, but it also really gives me hope that, you know, we do have a lot of students that are experiencing some trauma, and we do have a lot of high needs kids. But I do see a lot of our students are actually, you know, coping with this really well. And they have so many, you know, so many funny and witty and insightful ways of looking at this. And they have so much hope and positivity. That's one of the benefits of them still being young and optimistic and curious. And so I'm really trying to channel some of that, you know, into how I'm looking at things. Just, you know, and I think that it also gives me hope to hear and to see so many people have an increased appreciation for education and for teachers, and for the conversations to start taking place about how we can take this opportunity to overhaul some of the problems that have existed in education long before the COVID pandemic. It gives me hope that we will start to really dig in and address some of these gaps that we see within education, and to really, you know, dig into, you know, to make this an equitable, to create equitable pathways for learning for our kids, and to take advantage of this stop and pause opportunity.
No, thank you. We did have a couple more questions coming through. One question is, if the district does decide that students could go back to school, as a big sister, I'm scared to send my little sister. Do you think she can learn online like they're learning now? So is the school district also considering giving parents a choice between the two?
I hope so. I mean, it sounded like that from the survey. That was an option on there, and I completely relate to that, because, you know, I'm scared for my daughter, I'm scared for my nieces and nephew, and I'm scared for my own students too. All I can hope is that they will give that option for parents. I think that they will, because I can imagine a lot of parents just simply pulling their students from school and having them complete independent study or homeschool. And so I think that if they don't at least provide that option for parents and for guardians, that they're going to have a lot of students disenroll. And for districts, you know, they care a lot about attendance, because attendance equals dollars. And so if they're smart, they are going to provide an option, and they are going to find some sort of way to incorporate attendance taking on distance, you know, within distance learning, so that they can keep students enrolled, but keep families comfortable with what school looks like. So I really, really hope that they do have that option. And I do also know that, you know, this is also new to us. And so I had to ask Dr. Rojas how to even, you know, share my screen earlier. And so one of the things that I see moving forward is that we as teachers will continue to get better at using this technology and figuring out, just like we do with any other lesson, how we can reach our kids. And so even though it's been difficult, I do have confidence that we as teachers will be able to provide a high quality education if we are given more time, training, resources, and our kids are given that opportunity as well. And so I hope for your sister and for all of our kiddos that they do have an option that's going to make, you know, families comfortable and without sacrificing their learning.
Thank you. And then another question, do you know how kids that have learning disabilities at your school have been coping with distance learning?
That's a great question as well. And so I have a number of students who are pushed in from our SDC classes. I also have a number of students who are resource students and are receiving extra support. For the most part, during this time, we've been instructed to just reach out to them and touch base and see how they're doing. But the work that they're being given is being given from their SDC or from their resource teachers. And so they're not really expected to do the work from every class, you know, remembering that they have 6 classes. And so for the most part, I've just been kind of checking in with them and you know, to see how they're doing. Also, our resource teachers, our special education teachers have been great, and we as a team have been great with asking kids, is there a teacher that you would like to check in with? And we've been given, you know, we've been giving them surveys. We check in weekly on Google Classroom. And so for a lot of those kids that maybe aren't in contact with teachers because they're doing work mainly for their SDC or resource teachers, they're still able to like ask for you know, for opportunities to touch in with other teachers. So I've been on the phone with one little girl in particular a few times because, you know, she's not doing my work because she's doing just her resource work, but she is still getting those emotional needs met by having conversations with me on the phone. But, you know, that is moving forward, something we're going to have to think about, you know, because a lot of our students, they benefit from having that in-person, you know, instruction, breaking it down for them and explaining in different, you know, unique ways as we're sort of limited online. And so, you know, so far I think that they're surviving like the rest of us, but moving forward, we're going to have to figure out how we can still modify and meet their needs and make sure that we're meeting our IEP goals for these kids.
Great. Well, I think that's it in terms of questions, Lucia. Is there anything else that you wanted to add?
No, just, you know, thanks for the opportunity to share my experience. It's been a very surreal one. And I know that, you know, we all have similar fears and hopes right now. So I just feel glad to be part of a community of potential educators or of educators who are just, you know, looking out for our own health and also our own, the health and the needs of our students. It's been inspiring to be a part of those groups. So thank you.
No, we want to thank you. And I want to thank folks in this space. You're right that these are all future teachers and folks that are going to watch the recording as well. So I want to thank you for your time and experience and for sharing that experience. And so folks, I will make sure that I send the recording to everyone, but thank you so much for being here and sharing this space.
Of course. Thank you.
Thank you.